So I have some cookies here, and you can see that the pattern resembles a quilt. Now I'll show you how to do this technique. So I have a plain square uniced cookie, and you can do this on any shape that you'd like. I'll take my cardstock ruler and just place this over the cookie. And now with my edible ink marker, I'm just going to divide this cookie in half diagonally. And then rotate the cookie and do the same in the other direction, like this. So next, I'm going to take one of these 1-inch increments and line it up with the center line so that there are 2 on each side. So I have 1 here and 1 here, and I have 1 here and 1 here. So I'll just make a little line here and 1 here. Same thing on both sides. Now I'll rotate this, do the same thing again. Line up one of these 1-inch increments with the center line and make a mark here and here, and 1 over here, and then 1 at the end like that. So now I just want to extend these lines all the way across, keeping this parallel with the center line. So you always want to make sure that you can see this line. So you don't want to try to come up here and make this, because then you can't tell if it's parallel here. So just keep this below this line, extend this all the way across, and then just make a little mark down here. Rotate that again. Make sure that this is always parallel with this line. Extend that all the way across, and then extend this line over here. So you're just going to do this all the way around, making sure that your lines are parallel. And then we'll just finish this up so that we have a grid. So now I'm going to take my Flood Consistency Royal Icing and a round tip number 2. And I'm using a medium shade of green here. You can use any shade that you like. I'm just going to dab my tip on a paper towel, squeeze a little bit of icing out onto a piece of wax paper just to make sure that it's flowing smoothly. So now we can come back in and start filling in these squares. I'll just start at the top and just carefully outline these sections here with light pressure. You don't want to go too heavy. Then as I move in, I'm going to increase my pressure a little bit so that we have a nice mound of icing. And then I'll put my icing to the side just for a moment. And now I'll use the scribe tool to help really sharpen those edges. So you just want to bring it out to the corners so that we have very nice sharp corners on each of these sections. Make sure that your scribe tool is clean in between each one. And then I'll just move on to the next square. So just very carefully outline each section. And at this point, I'm not going to bring the icing up to meet this point right now. I'm just going to leave it a little bit away from there. So go ahead and fill that in. So now I'm going to bring this icing up to meet the last square, just so that it barely touches. So I'm just using my scribe tool to push that icing up to that point. So then I'll just continue filling in these squares, making sure to fill in every other square so that we have a checkerboard pattern when we're finished. You can also use a toothpick here instead of a scribe tool. So now that we've filled in our squares, we have a checkerboard pattern on the cookie. You're going to want to let this dry for at least 2 hours in front of a fan so that these squares get really dry before moving on to the next step. I have one here that's already dry. So now we can fill these in. So you're just going to start at the edge and pipe this line right up against the edge of these squares that you already have piped. So this is just like before, outline and fill in. And then you're going to use your scribe tool to help push that up against the edge. At this point, you don't want to have to touch it too much because you want to keep these lines really nice and straight. So as little movement as possible is best, but you just want to fill in all these little spaces here and then get it right up to the edge here. Now we can fill in our next square. Pipe it as close to the other square as possible so that you don't have to touch it too much with the scribe tool. Fill that in. And then use the scribe tool to get it into these little corners here. I'm using a tip number 2 here because these spaces are small, so it's better to have a small tip to fit into those small squares. So now I'll just continue to fill these in. Now we have all of our squares filled in, and you can see that it really has that quilted look to it. I'm going to show you what happens if you don't wait long enough before piping the sections. You can see here that I piped my first row and I didn't wait long enough to pipe the second, so they don't have the definition between the squares like they do over here. So make sure to let your cookie dry overnight, and then you'll have a beautiful quilted cookie. There are many different ways that you can use this technique. You can see here that I made this pattern on a different shape cookie, and I added a fondant button in the middle. You can also add some beads to each of the corners. You can also use this technique to make a patchwork effect. In this cookie, I added a monogram and some stitches. So now that you know how to make a quilted cookie, you can play around with this technique and see what you come up with.